I'm glad to see you today. I'm grateful to all the folks that helped to bring this day together, all the liturgical leaders and to the choir. It's nice to have the choir back, isn't it? And everybody who brought food, I know a lot of folks have brought food, and there's a lot of people that have helped set up and are going to help manage the picnic after church. Thank you for that. And for those of you online who can't join us today, we're sorry you can't be here, but we understand that sometimes circumstances are such that you can't be in church. But you have an important role to play in the support of the church and, of course, your continued prayers for this congregation. And I also want to thank all of you who are in the pews today, because your presence here matters more than you might imagine. Occasionally I get reminded of that reality, the importance of our presence. A parishioner dropped by my office the other day and she told me this story. She said that she wasn't feeling it one Sunday morning. In fact, she confessed that she hadn't been feeling it for a while because COVID had sort of taken the wind out of her church sails. But she came anyway. Willpower won the day. It was fueled by enough data points of church, enough self-awareness to remember that she never regretted going to church once she got to church. Sort of like going to the gym. You with me? I mean, you rarely regret the workout after it happens. The analogy works for church as well, which is why we call Epiphany a spiritual gym. Have you heard that? Anyway, she was going to leave after the service, but somebody sort of dragged her into a coffee hour where she ran into a young woman she knew. That's what happens. You get to know people over time. And the woman shared something with her that was going on in her family. And it was in that moment that she said she knew why she came to church. To be a neighbor. Just be there to listen to that story. See, sometimes being a good neighbor means setting aside your plans because God has something else planned for you. You know, there's only really two reasons to go to church: God and neighbor. The God part is complicated. The neighbor part is simple. God is complicated because there's a lot to talk about. There's a lot to think about. There's a lot to try to figure out because God is everywhere. Am I right? God's out there. God's in here. There's a lot of God. Our neighbor, on the other hand, is right here. Our neighbor is always defined by presence, person to person. God created us with these bodies so we could be good neighbors, with hands to do things, with heads to think, with smiles to put on our face, with ears to listen to somebody who has a story to tell you at coffee hour. The neighbor is a fragile concept. We saw it diminished by the pandemic, which put a hard stop to all but our most bubbled communities. We stopped going to the gym. We stopped going to the symphony. We stopped going to the theater. We stopped going to the museum. Sporting events stopped. Dinner parties died out. School went virtual. Do you remember that? When school, thumbs down on school going virtual. I'm getting it. And we stopped going to church. All person to person stopped. And it had to for our health and for the health of our neighbors. For many of us, this moratorium on meeting was a blessing. It put a screeching halt on the hectic. And yet, we could still connect in many ways, right? Maybe even more carefully curated ways through Zoom and Teams for cocktail hour. On Pandora for the symphony or YouTube for a sermon. and we could work from wherever we wanted to. That sufficed. It was maybe even a little bit indolent. Maybe it felt a little bit good. Maybe it was even needed. The great timeout put a pause on our patterns and gave us time to slow down. It also allowed us to manage our community when we wanted, where we wanted, the way we wanted. We could watch a sermon on Monday morning at 4 a.m. in our pajamas with a glass of wine. It's not a pretty picture, but it's possible. For many of us that weren't first responders, time became our time and place became our place, and we could be the kings and queens of our own little dominions, no longer needing to bow down to the community patterns of time and place. A little bit. Alexis de Tocqueville, in his book Democracy in America, noted after his visit to the United States in 1831, and I quote, that Americans' habit of always considering themselves as standing alone is apt to fill their imagination with the idea that their destiny is in their own hands, thus believing their life rests upon themselves, which threatens in the end to confine them entirely to the solitude of their own heart. End of quote. Ted Anthony, in his May 26th Associated Press article, called this the John Wayne paradigm and argued that it may be killing us. John Wayne may have ridden in to save the day, but at the end of the day, he wandered away, making it, it seems, more about him than the neighbor he was there to serve. Because a good neighbor is more about shaking a hand than shooting a villain. That's what the neighborhood church is all. So remember that, okay? That's what the neighborhood church is all about. I know this from experience. You know, when Kristen and I moved to Cleveland Heights a long time ago, we started going to church at St. Paul's Episcopal Church. And we would sneak in right at 8:01, and we would sit in the back row, because I grew up as an Episcopalian, so I knew what to do. And we did that every Sunday for years, even on the weekend when all of our families were in town to celebrate Kristen's graduation from medical school. It was our habit. But on that particular Sunday, that graduation Sunday, in that very small early morning congregation, Bill Fuller, the priest at the Peace, announced that Kristen had graduated from medical school. And all those old people, they seemed old to us. It's a long time ago. All those old people, many of whom we didn't even know their names, just swarmed us and surrounded us and shook Kristen's hand. And that was one of the most beautiful expressions of neighborliness that I have ever experienced. And here's the odd part. That 8 a.m. service was the only uncurated community that Kristen and I were a part of. And maybe that's why it was so special. We didn't pick it. God did. We just showed up. What I mean by uncurated community is every other community that Kristen and I were a part of then, and it's probably true now, had a barrier to entry. To live next door to us there in Cleveland Heights, you had to be able to afford a house in that neighborhood, right? To go to graduate school with us, you had to get into the program. To be a work colleague, you had to be employed at the same place we were employed at. To be a tennis partner, you had to play tennis. Smart choir. They're smarter after going to England. Right, and all of those were curated communities. Only church wasn't. Maybe that's why church is weird. Now don't nod. You don't nod when I say church is weird. Right, like no barrier to entry, no status to it. It's even a little risky. Because you might find that the only thing you have in common with someone is God. But here's what I'm seeing. There's a deep thirst for uncurated community. I was reminded of this when I was in London this summer. A young man who attends Epiphany was studying abroad there, and he came to join us one evening for Evensong at St. Paul's. And when he arrived, shook my hand and he said to me, "It's so good to see my Epiphany family." And he didn't say that because he knew everyone there. In fact, he might not have even recognized everyone. But it was because he knew he was stepping back into his uncurated community, a community that cared about him because they had worshiped with him in these very pews that you are sitting in today. Your presence in this place matters more than you might think. The presence of unqualified community, however, is fragile. I recently read a book called The Great Dechurching, which is full of statistics about the demise of the church. And what the authors found is the shrinkage of the church wasn't the specific result of the church being too political, or being too judgmental, or being too hierarchical, or being too archaic. While some churches are these things, none of these things was the thing itself. What the authors found was less dramatic and sadder. That people were just sort of fading away. Not because they don't believe in God, because they said they indeed mostly do believe in God. But I suspect they had forgotten that they were needed as a neighbor. I suspect the dechurching of America has a lot to do with the success of the John Wayne paradigm. Which is why we have an epidemic of loneliness and isolation in this nation. And where it's most chronic and probably most underreported and most critically concerning is with our young people. There's a deep thirst for unqualified community, where you don't have to be great, where you don't have to only be with people your own age, where you don't have to apply to get in, where you're not judged for being there. You're just loved by a community that God has chosen for you. And that is weird in a world that is all about status and achievement and control. But I'll take weird over John Wayne any day. Which brings me to Jesus, who's no John Wayne. He did not wear cowboy boots. He did not even have a cowboy hat. He wore a beret. I think he wore a beret. I'm not sure. Join me in reading the Bible and we'll find out. Right? I think it's somewhere. It's hidden in the Old Testament, what Jesus wore. Anyway, this is what I do know about Jesus. I do know that he instructed us to bind and to loose as the methodology for inviting people to experience God's community. And the binding and the loosing that we hear about today is about the things that we take on and the things we let go of as a way of making space for our neighbor in our lives. The binding and the loosing are different tools towards the same end for holding gently the fragility of human community in a place that reveals the love of God. The church is about two things: It's about loving God and loving our neighbor. And what I do know about you is that you're a good neighbor. And I know that because I know you and I know the vibrancy of this community. Now, next Sunday at the Forum at 10 o'clock, I'm going to be talking about what's going on in the broader Episcopal Church and the challenges for the church. But I'm also going to be talking about why Epiphany is thriving. But the short answer as to why we're thriving is because you know how to be a good neighbor. So keep at it. Keep up the good work. Your presence here has a greater impact than you might think, which is why I'm so glad to see you here today.